Talk about this guy, Carlton O'Brien. Carlton, I had to look it up. I mean, as a proud member of the Irish American tribe out of New England, I'd never heard of a guy named Carlton before. Not Carlton O'Brien. Carlton is it's an old British name. It means a leader of a teeny village. So, anyway, Carlton O'Brien, aka Michael McGovern, he was born in 1903, he died in 1952. He was a Rhode Island mobster. He's one of the last independent gamblers in the state before the Patriarca guys took it over completely. O'Brien managed to get himself listed as public enemy number one in Rhode Island at one point in his life. His record included arrests for breaking and entering larceny up in Cranston, 1921. Suspended sentence, that comes into play later. 1924, assault with a dangerous weapon down in Newport, nolly processed, means they couldn't prove the case. 1924, breaking and entering in Newport, and that's when that suspended sentence came into play. He was still under suspended sentence when he got arrested for that B&E in Newport, and they sent him away for 5 years on that one. He was paroled in 1926, so he did, what, 2 years only, of course. In 1927, he was sent to the Providence County Jail for violating the grounds of his parole. In October 28, 1929, they got him for transporting liquor, basically, from Rhode Island to Massachusetts. 1930, intent to rob in New Bedford, defaulted. In March of 1930, when O'Brien was 26 years old, so he's a young man when all this was taking place, he was pulled in for questioning in the very brutal murder of a guy named Ray Hacking, who was also a rum runner, but he was a government informant as well. He was beaten beyond recognition and he was shot, and they dumped him on the side of a road over in South Attleboro, Mass. Police knew that the last person to see him alive was O'Brien. In 1931, they got him again, keeping and exposing liquor illegally in Northampton, I think is in Massachusetts. He paid a $200 fine. It's a good chunk of change in 1931. 1931, also, they got him under false pretenses in Providence, found not guilty. 1935, held as a suspect in a Hartford, Connecticut robbery. That was dismissed. Held for suspicion with an assault and intent to kill in Albany, New York. Found not guilty. 1936, suspicious person again in Providence. I don't know how suspicious he could have been. He was gangster number one. Anyway, O'Brien was also involved in the 1950s Brinks robbery through his friend Specs O'Keefe, Joe Specs O'Keefe. In fact, O'Brien and O'Keefe were probably two of the three architects of the plan. O'Brien was named as a principal in the Brinks holdup by a guy named Alfred Gagnon, who was being held over in the Rhode Island State Prison. What did we say? Rika, I think we used to call her Rika. I've forgotten. Anyway, Gagnon had worked for O'Brien since the Prohibition days, and he was also questioned in the butchering of Ray Hacking, the squealer, in 1930. By the way, when he let loose, when Gagnon said, yeah, O'Brien was one of the architects of this thing, of the robbery, they had questioned him in a marathon 7-hour interrogation. They questioned him in shifts. So would that have held up in court? I don't know. Anyway, regardless, Gagnon, he was also Rhode Island. He was a renowned liar, so one way or the other. In fact, when Gagnon originally named O'Brien as one of the three main planners of the robbery, the Massachusetts officials just scoffed and they said, no, it can't be. But, 56 hours later, there was a dead O'Brien in front of his house, 2 shotgun blasts. O'Brien was murdered, probably almost definitely by the mob, on the day before he was to be questioned by the FBI on the Brinks robbery. But that isn't what led to his murder. What led to his murder was his on and off again fight with Raymond Patriarca to control Rhode Island's gambling rackets. And because O'Brien interfered constantly with Patriarca's takeover of the racing wire service in southern New England. That was a big deal, a face-saving thing for Patriarca, because that takeover of the racing wire service was happening all across America at the same time. Out in California, the Chicago mob had Mickey Cohen running their end of it. Bugsy Siegel was in on it, trying to take it over in the Midwestern, in the Western states. So he couldn't, Patriarca would lose face if he didn't get control of this thing. So O'Brien operated several large bookie joints around Rhode Island. Rhode Island's a relatively small state, so large bookie things take up a lot of business. And he refused to go along with Patriarca, who was increasing the wire service fees. So instead, O'Brien set up his own wire service in Massachusetts, and he bootlegged the information down into Rhode Island and into southern New England at much lower rates than Patriarca was charging, because basically he was stealing the information from Patriarca service. He had no cost, The night he was murdered, O'Brien had been out at Providence. He was at a diner he owned called the Burns Pullman Diner. He left there at about 2:30 a.m., returned to his very lavish home at 33 Crosslands Road in West Warwick, not Cranston, at about 3 a.m. They say he lived in Cranston. He did. Two different places. At 3 a.m. when he was shot down. He lived just a few doors, by the way, from the home of the Warwick police chief. He was the co-owner, but also of a nightclub, popular place called The Farm in Warwick. It was very respectable by all reports. The assassin waited behind a tall set of bushes for O'Brien to get out of his car. When he did, he walked up in front of O'Brien and blasted him. He got the first one. It left a 6-inch diameter hole on his right side by his belly. And the second one, he took that to the head. 9 pellets were pulled out of his skull eventually. His wife, Anna, discovered his body at 4:45 a.m. She said she'd been worried about her husband. He wasn't home. He usually came home at exactly 3 or whatever it was. And she looked out the bedroom window and she saw him laying about 10 feet from the front door. She ran out thinking perhaps he had fainted or something. It's generally agreed that O'Brien's killer was the professional murderer, Trigger Burke, who was